Now that James Harden has finally been traded to the LA Clippers, as we've been expecting for months, now we have to figure out exactly what Philadelphia is trying to do with the stuff that they got in return for Harden. Now, I think what's been made really clear in the days since the Harden trade is that this isn't a deal that Philadelphia necessarily wanted to make. Yes, they got some stuff back. They got some wings that are going to help them this year. They got some future first round picks, some cap space. We're going to talk about all that stuff, but presumably this is a deal that they could have tried to get in exchange from LA months ago and not had to deal with all of the Harden issues. The reason for keeping him was to try and get a better return than this, was to try and get a star in exchange for him, was to try and help your team more this season. And I think it's reasonable to expect that now they're still going to try and accomplish that goal just with the assets that they got in exchange for Harden. Now, certainly the way that Philadelphia started the year, they're capable of still being a good team to begin this season. Tyrese Maxey looks like he's ready to take another step, and they're still good enough defensively, especially now with all these added wings, to where Embiid and Maxey's scoring, some three-point shooting, and some defense is good enough, in my opinion, still to keep them in the top 4 and the top 5 of the Eastern Conference. And that's kind of where they were even with Harden anyway. But it's clear that Daryl Morey, being the kind of GM that he is, understanding the situation possibly here with Joel Embiid coming up, where he might want to, request a trade or be out of Philadelphia, he understands he still has to be aggressive with these assets that he has in exchange from the Clippers. And it's going to be interesting to see kind of where he looks for an upgrade on this roster. I think it's clear that that's the direction they're going to go, because they went from this one big salary in James Harden making like $35 million a year, a guy that not many teams really wanted. It wasn't very easy to find a real good fit for him, given the fact that he keeps requesting trades. He's an unrestricted free agent. He's going to want this big contract. All those things were definitely issues. But now that you turn Harden into Marcus Morris, Nick Batum, Robert Covington, guys that, yes, can help your basketball team in the meantime, but more realistically, their contracts are much, much easier to move, whether it be in exchange for a star whose salary matched what Harden's would be, or at least very close to it, or maybe a smaller upgrade on the perimeter. I think the first place that Daryl Morey is going to look is certainly going to be at stars, at guys that he couldn't have gotten in exchange for Harden, because Harden didn't make sense in these new situations and he didn't want to have to wait around and try and rope a third team into it. But essentially it will look like a 3-team deal by the time it's all said and done. For example, I think Chicago could certainly look at trading Zach LaVine in exchange for some of the draft capital that Philadelphia has, as well as what they got in exchange for Harden. And like I said, now the Clippers have some smaller salaries that make the LaVine trade much easier, because Chicago doesn't want anything to do with James Harden. But in exchange for LaVine, if they really do decide to reset things, they can get some draft compensation. Another place to potentially look is going to be in Toronto, and I think this is a really interesting possibility, because if you really believe in Tyrese Maxey, then maybe you don't want to put someone like Zach LaVine alongside him, and you'd rather put a front court player alongside Joel Embiid and be an incredibly punishing front court team. And I think the pairing of Siakam and Embiid together is not only really interesting, but really exciting, and can work super, super well because of their abilities to space on the perimeter. They're both, at times perimeter-oriented players, despite how bruising Embiid can be in the paint. And more importantly, the reason that Siakam is especially interesting in comparison to someone like Zach LaVine or someone else that maybe already has a long-term contract is because the other part of this deal for Philadelphia, and why maybe PJ Tucker was involved in the deal in the first place, is because it creates all of this cap space for them in the upcoming 2024 offseason. Now, there's some caveats to that, because they still need to re-sign Tyrese Maxey to a new number. Potentially, maybe he's going to be a trade asset for them in that offseason. And then, of course, obviously, if they do trade for Siakam, they would still have to re-sign him, but it does give them options. And it's clear the entire time that they were trying to figure out the James Harden thing, even going back to a year ago, they wanted to prioritize cap space, whether it be once Tobias Harris contract comes off, whether it be if they, look to move Maxey in a sign and trade in the same offseason. And then, of course, when they were trying to figure out what the new contract would look like for James Harden, and Pascal Siakam continues to fit all of their goals, where yes, you don't want to trade a ton of stuff in exchange for Siakam just for him to end up leaving. And then obviously the fit of him alongside Tobias Harris on the front court can get pretty weird. But at the end of the day, if you're just trying to make a star play, it makes sense to have Siakam there. Then you can pay him more money than you would be otherwise once you get to the 2024 offseason. But unless it is a star of like Zach LaVine's caliber, where Philadelphia feels really strongly that he's really going to help them improve and push for a title, I would expect it to be more like a Siakam style move, and then still maintain that salary cap space in the offseason. Now, the thing that makes me nervous, or would make me nervous if I was a Sixers fan, is yes, right now, today, it sounds nice that you got rid of James Harden, that you have extra draft capital, that you have these contracts, potentially make a trade in the middle of the year, and that you have cap space to spend in free agency in 2024. And even though that looks like a really promising situation to put together a really good team around Joel Embiid, to get someone else with that space, you'd have to lose Tobias Harris. You potentially have to lose Tyrese Maxey, potentially have to lose, if you trade for Siakam or LaVine or whoever. So it's not as clean as, oh my gosh, we can trade for Siakam and then we can pay Maxey and then we can, go and get this other star. It's not as clean as that. That's not exactly how it's going to work for them. And if you look at it at a certain angle, it almost looks like something similar to what Toronto did a handful of years ago, where they traded for Kawhi Leonard in exchange for DeMar DeRozan. And if it worked out, they would win the title and then they would re-sign Kawhi. But if it didn't, they would have a clean slate. They would have all this cap space and then the ability to rebuild the team. And if you look at the Philadelphia situation from a certain angle, it looks kind of similar to that, is that maybe the season doesn't go as well as they hope. Maybe they make an in-season move, but aren't as aggressive as Embiid would like them to be. And then in the offseason, he says, hey, the salary cap space is cool. I like Maxey, but I'd like to go somewhere else. And at that point, it's a little easier to listen to Joel Embiid's trade demand in that sense, because then you really have the ability to completely reset. Now, obviously, the issue is you still have some outgoing first-round picks, and those are some things that you're going to have to deal with, but that's a sunk cost at this point. And if Embiid says that he wants to request a trade in this offseason, then it's something that, as we've learned, most of the time stars are going to get their way. However, I would expect from this point until the trade deadline, Daryl Morey is going to look at all of his options in trying to bring in a player in replacement of Harden. Not necessarily in the backcourt alongside Maxey, but someone similar caliber of that, because he saw that if they played better in the later stages of that series against Boston, they could have made the conference finals. They would have had a really good matchup against Miami, and they maybe could have made the finals last year. And even though Harden is now gone, it's easy to see options for them given these new contracts that they have, as well as their future first round picks that they now have. It's easy to see options where they can go out and get a player to replace him. And that is what I would expect them to do. I don't know that it's 100% going to happen. And if it doesn't, it's going to be for one of two reasons. One, Morey just didn't like the deal. We know that he's not going to make a deal that he doesn't like, unless in this scenario, he felt like he was kind of forced to, or maybe he's starting to look at the 2024 offseason as a situation in which they can start to reset. The problem with that, if you're Daryl Morey, is it's unlikely that he would survive losing Joel Embiid and still be the GM of the Sixers. So on paper, it looks cool that, oh my gosh, we're going to rebuild. We're going to have this cap space. We're going to trade Embiid for a ton of stuff, and we're going to move forward, and we're going to have all these assets. That sounds cool on paper, but if you're the guy actually in charge and you don't know if your job is secure if you lose Joel Embiid, given the situation that he kind of inherited, that's obviously a concern. So right now, I'm expecting they're going to be aggressive for the next couple of months, try and find somebody with these contracts, with these picks. It might not happen immediately. They're going to wait on some teams like Chicago, potentially, like Toronto, potentially, to fall apart, maybe be a little bit more willing to trade away their stars in exchange for draft picks. And at that point, they're going to be really aggressive trying to bring some guys in. And if they are able to bring in someone like that, I would expect them to be right up there with the contenders. They're not going to be on the same level as Milwaukee and Boston in the East, given their upgrades this offseason, but they're going to be pretty close. And that is kind of where Morey wants to be. He wants to have his multiple stars, and he wants to be close. And they're going to have the opportunity to do that because of the Harden trade. I don't think it's the trade that Morey wanted to make. I don't think it's one that he was excited to make, but at the end of the day, he realized that he didn't really have that much of a choice. The situation continued to get weirder and weirder, and as always, the star got their way. But what I want to know down in the comment section below is where you guys think Morey is going to be looking for that star upgrade. Do you think it's going to be in free agency? Do you think there's some big time free agent they're going to be able to bring in with that cap space, depending on how the numbers work out? Or where around the league do you think they're going to be looking, whether it be Siakam, whether it be Levine, whether it be somebody else? Who knows? At this point, there are a lot of possibilities. They have the assets to make something work. I want to know down in the comment section below where you guys think Morey's going to go looking and who the new star is going to be potentially in Philadelphia.